All right. Well, yeah. Thank you for hosting me here today. I will speak about the relationship of the digital space and how it's exploited by extremists. I'm a research fellow at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, a London-based think tank that focuses on radicalization prevention. And I've been looking at both how Islamist extremists, but also how far-right extremists have used some of the new infrastructural, social, but also cultural dynamics in the digital space. And I will address mostly the tactics and strategies used by these two forms of extremism, but of course there are also other forms of extremism that I'm not specifically referring to here, but there's only so much time, and spending my time in neo-Nazi chat rooms and Islamist extremist chat rooms is, I think, more than enough in terms of monitoring different extremists. But yeah, I think I'll speak about, does it work? Is it connected? Okay, great. Thank you. So actually this is very much about this intersection of the two problems of the new media ecosystems that Ethan mentioned in his introductory remarks. So about how bad, I think he called them bad players or bad agents, exploit some of the known bugs that we see in these new ecosystems. And I'd like to speak about different ways that extremists have exploited these bugs, so mostly the effects of echo chambers, but also some of the conspiracy theories, some of the ways in which some of the new filter bubbles that have formed on the new platforms. And I'd like to speak mostly about radicalization campaigns, but also influencer campaigns and intimidation campaigns. So let's start with outlining what the challenge is that we're focusing also at ISD right now when speaking about extremism. So obviously the goal of any group, any extremist group, is always to bring about political change in the long term. And what we've seen now is that we've been monitoring both extremists that use media-political strategies, such as using protests, campaigns, but also information, disinformation operations in order to bring about this change. But then we've also monitored, obviously, some of the more militant groups, such as jihadists, for example, or also militant far-right groups that use violence, either try to inspire violence and self-starter attacks, or really coordinate and orchestrate some of these acts of violence. And so the reason why I'm kind of dividing this talk into three different sections is that I think there are three different audiences that extremists try to speak to. So there are radicalization campaigns that really target sympathizers. But then there are also influencer campaigns, such as around the elections. For example, now in Italy, I've been closely following how Italian extreme right groups have mobilized in order to influence some of the election outcomes. And that's targeted at what the alt-right, for example, would call the normies, or Islamist extremists would call gray zone Muslims. And then the third category is directed against political opponents, or that could be journalists, activists, politicians, and that's intimidation strategies. So I'm going to go through these three different approaches that are within this extremist toolkit of how to exploit some of these known bugs that the new media ecosystems have provided them with. So let's start with the radicalization campaigns. I think one of the biggest trends right now that we've probably all been watching very closely is the creation of new echo chambers, and especially through the creation of alt tech platforms. So for example, the alt-right has created their own platforms, but also Islamists have created their own platforms that have almost built up to a new online universe that is in a way in competition with some of the bigger Silicon Valley hegemons. And this, in combination with the use of hyper-targeted strategies to enlarge these echo chambers, to bring in more people from outside of these alternative media ecosystems to bring them into their alt tech platform universe is something we've seen, and I'm going to mention a few examples and some of the results of the recent research pieces that we did on that. But so the second part of this radicalization strategy is to enlarge these echo chambers, or to connect these echo chambers with echo chambers of other extremists from abroad, and to collaborate both across borders. For example, we've seen a lot of collaboration recently between the American alt-right with some of the European-based extreme right groups. But then on the other hand, also cross-ideological collaboration. Again, I will mention some more specific examples. This is really just to give you an idea of the different approaches that are used in different parts of this extremist toolkit of radicalization and mainstreaming their ideologies. But then once these echo chambers are becoming increasingly large and increasingly interconnected, what is the third part of the strategy is really the exploitation of youth culture and of online subcultures. And they've often managed to tap into very specific online youth cultures by using gamification. Javier Lesaca has done some great work on how ISIS has used some of these gaming-like propaganda materials, but also the alt-right has, of course, done that. And in addition to that, they've also used, for example, memes, jokes, or a rhetoric of transgression in order to camouflage sometimes their very extreme ideologies and hide behind these kind of jokes to mainstream them. So let's look at these extremist echo chambers. On the extreme right, we have, of course, a creation that has especially accelerated since all the aftermath of Charlottesville, where a lot of the tech providers, the bigger ones, especially Facebook, Twitter, but also some of the smaller ones such as Discord and Telegram, well, mostly Discord, have taken down contents and accounts in reaction to that. And I think really within the last 6 months or so, there has therefore been a move and a major mass migration towards alternative tech platforms. And one of those one of those categories of alt tech platforms are, of course, social media platforms. So we've seen, for example, the creation of Gab last summer, the creation of Minds and similar networks that are supposed to be in favor of freedom of speech, but wouldn't remove contents even by, for example, neo-Nazis such as Andrew Anglin. Then we've also seen the same happening for crowdsourcing platforms such as Patreon, for example, which also was created in competition or after Patreon removed some of the funders that were from the extreme right, or some of the projects that were used for extreme right mobilization campaigns. So we see all the creators here, or the featured creators here. I think their projects speak for themselves. Most of the names will be familiar, like Andrew Anglin, Brittany Pettibone, Richard Spencer. And of course, we've also seen dating platforms even. And there are even, Facebook pages where the alt-right has created their own dating groups, their own, but also Wasp Love is one of the, what does it say here? Well, yeah, dating reform, Christian, quiverful, Confederate, homeschooled, Christian identity, white nationalism, alt-right, sovereign, race symbols. So yeah, I think this is quite an interesting one, but we're seeing similar dynamics, although in a slightly different way on the Islamist extremist side, because they have different incentives. Sometimes it's more about not being detected, but sometimes it's also about creating their own online echo chamber, their own online universe in which they can operate freely and without being monitored. And so, for example, one of the groups that I've been closely watching is a German-English, it's a bilingual group, where they speak a lot about developing. They've now actually managed to develop their own encryption tool, which is called Muslim Tech, and they've also for example, developed tools where they can encrypt text within images, where they can send out also mass invitations, for example, to, I was going to mention that I think in my next slide, oh, this one is a different one, yeah, where they can send out mass invitations to Arabic or Muslim sounding names. So this is something where we've also seen this hyper-targeting of their target audiences. And yeah, they started, I think, to use this in December and November. This hyper-targeting is also something we see on the alt-right. So for example, we've been analyzing the communication campaigns around before the Charlottesville rally took place, and we've been both monitoring the encrypted messaging or the encrypted messaging forums where they have coordinated these communication campaigns, but also then looked at what has actually been put out in terms of propaganda, marketing on the different platforms. And doing this cross-platform analysis really showed that they used a lot of different communication strategies and even different language that was very much tailored to the different target audiences. So for example, when they would target more a mainstream audience on Twitter or Facebook, they would use more the general grievances as a starting point for what they would call red pill. So they would use, of course, topics such as immigration or terrorism that are perceived as general grievances among the broader public. But then once they get into, for example, the fringe platforms, neo-Nazi forums, they would adopt a lot more explicit rhetoric that actually gives away some of their ideologies. So they would speak specifically about white identity, and they would have anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And then sometimes when they speak to more, for example, Southern US audience that might have grievances about Southern heritage, they would adopt that kind of rhetoric. When they are on the for example, the manosphere, the gaming boards, they would speak about anti-feminism. So it's almost like a micro-marketing strategy that some of the private sector companies adopt. And that has, in a way, also enabled them to mainstream that, because by crossing these ideological boundaries, they've been able to, in a way, bring it into the mainstream. So I think another important trend that we've seen, especially shaping up in the last year, is this cross-border collaboration and campaigns that are being done in multiple languages across Europe, but also then crossing the Atlantic and coming to the US or vice versa. And this knowledge sharing between different groups in Europe and groups in the US. And one example of this that we also analyzed in terms of the social media interactions, but also the financing of that campaign, was the Defend Europe mission that was carried out by the white nationalist Generation Identity, the Génération Identitaire, which is a pan-European movement that originated, of course, in France, but then spread to other European countries, and now has increasingly also made links to American alt-right activists. And one of the most interesting things we found here is that the Defend Europe mission was really to stop NGOs from bringing refugees to Europe, from rescuing refugees in the Mediterranean Sea. And it was really a European-focused mission, and all of their tweets were coming out of Europe initially, but then they also managed to get some of the bigger American YouTube personalities from the alt-right to tweet about it, to speak about it. So in the end, it ended up being crowdsourced, and most of the crowdsourcing actually came from the US. So there we also see how they've been really amplifying and widening the reach of these campaigns. And of course, things like Trump retweeting Britain First doesn't really help with that, especially creating even more kind of cross-border links between these groups. And then the other effect, or the other, I think, dangerous dynamic that we've spotted in terms of mobilizing especially the younger generations and Generation Z, which is perceived both by the alt-right and neo-Nazis as a generation that is more susceptible potentially to their propaganda, to their ideologies than any other generation in the last, any of the other generations that are still alive. And similarly, ISIS has also produced more foreign fighters in the age in the age group of 18 to 24. I think this is really a key target audience. So on both sides, we've seen this gamification happening. This is an example of the, we'll say, what we call in the German alt-right equivalent, the generation identity in Germany, but also another group that was connected to them, which is called Reconquista Germanica, which is a group that mainly operated online on the gaming application Discord to influence the outcome of the recent German election in September. And they were using, both of them were circulating manuals on how to conduct information warfare or mimetic warfare, on how to use fake accounts, operate them simultaneously. And for example, they were agreeing on hashtags and times to jointly push out their messages so that they would trick the algorithms into prioritizing them. And they used very clear structures here. So they had military language, even recruiting some of the people into the higher ranks of generals, officers, and so on. And they would also speak about virtual battlefields and armies. In a similar way as ISIS would speak about a cyber jihad, they would also speak about these virtual battlefields. And of course, then the use of memes and jokes is also something that they employed in quite a sophisticated way, for example, where they had databases that they created for memes that they would then push out. So influencer campaigns, that actually already leads me to the next point of where they try to mainstream their ideologies further and really bring them into or outside of their own filter bubbles and to the normies, or what they would call the normies. So I think we've really seen an emerging pattern of the information operations ecosystem. First, it was, of course, I think the first case was the US election, but we've seen very similar tactics and very similar dynamics in Europe, in the French election, the Dutch election, in the German, Austrian, and now in the Italian election, which just happened yesterday. So what we've been kind of following is this dynamic of where the recruiting and the initial mobilization takes place on the Chan boards or on YouTube and Reddit. So for example, 4chan, 8chan often are used still in English language as recruiting hubs to then bring people on board for these election influencer campaigns onto the encrypted messaging apps and the closed chat forums such as Telegram, but also the gaming app Discord and WhatsApp. And then then that's where they further radicalize people. That's where they share Holocaust-denying literature or, for example, ideologues that inspired fascism. So they would share these resources on the one hand to radicalize people further, but then also on the other hand, they would coordinate their information operations and their influencer campaigns. So they would discuss different hashtags and for example, how to target different audiences that they want to get to. They would agree on times to, and they would give, for example, they would circulate instructions on how to obfuscate your online identity and how to operate from different fake accounts and so on. And then they're taken on to the mainstream media platforms. So I'd like to give you the most recent example of this, Italy. We're actually just about to release a report this week about the Italian election influencer campaigns that were led by extreme right activists. And we found that it was exactly the same pattern as in previous elections. They had, on 4chan and other chan boards, they had threads where they tried to mobilize Italians especially, but also internationally. The initial one was in English, where they said, oh, we have to help Lega Nord, the far-right party, and Salvini to get into power. Let's mobilize, and they were sharing the links to then the encrypted, in this case, Telegram chats. They actually explicitly discussed why they would use Telegram instead of Discord this time, as opposed to previous elections. And And then, so then they directed the interested Jan reader or interested Jan user to these encrypted messaging apps where the conversations would continue mostly in Italian. However, we also found a few Americans in there and a few English language users. And then there were, so I was monitoring about 10 different chats on Telegram, but also WhatsApp, where they were then sharing memes, sharing news that they would then jointly release on the mainstream social media platforms. In this case, they had both a Facebook and an Instagram account. We're still in the process of analyzing what the actual impact was on social media. That's really something we've only started gathering data, considering it just happened yesterday. But we've been monitoring this in the run-up, in the 2 months run-up now to the election. And where we already have some data, and where we did the same basically, was the German election. And in general, German, what I would say is German alt-right mobilization. They also use the same vocabulary as the American alt-right. They also have exactly the same, they follow exactly the same ecosystem pattern of starting the recruitment and the mobilization again on 4chan, Reddit, and so on, and then directing people to the messaging apps. In this case, they use Discord because that allowed them, because of the infrastructure of Discord, that allowed them to delegate responsibilities, to have these very clear military-like structures, also again, military-like language, where they would then, have even different subsections of people focusing on different regions. They would then also sometimes mobilize with offline actions, but mostly online, sometimes specifically target political opponents with coordinated hate campaigns, or specifically carry out information or disinformation campaigns on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. And as we can see here, I'm not sure you can see it from there, but some of the campaigns really managed to get into the top trends, and I'm gonna, in a second, show you what the impact was. Oh, first about the tactics used. So they created, for example, this meme manager where they would upload memes in favor of Trump, but also the Alternative for Germany and Putin, and against the old parties or against Merkel. And they would coordinate around especially important news shows or important mainstream news articles that were published, and agree on the times that they would then target these and kind of hijack the hashtags used for these shows, so that they would show up in the newsfeed of people looking for normal information about these news shows. And yeah, as I mentioned previously, they also explicitly called on all the participating members of the group to set up fake accounts and to operate them simultaneously. So the effects of this, here's some of the impact analysis that we did, was that in the run-up to the election, the 2 weeks run-up, they managed to catapult some of the hashtags that they decided on into the top 5 trending hashtags in Germany, and they were really managing to sometimes influence the political debates, to influence the discourse online, but also then offline by being reported on by mainstream media, or being amplified by sometimes Russian bots, but sometimes, or bots in many cases, they were Russian, or sometimes by news outlets, sometimes Russian news outlets. So what we saw was, for example, that the Trau dich Deutschland hashtag was really surging in the last 2 weeks before the election in the trends, and that was because happened at the same time as the coordinated campaigns happened. So we compared the results from the social media monitoring with what we saw in terms of their coordination in the encrypted messaging apps. Now the last part of this toolkit of extremists is, of course, intimidation of anyone who opposes them, anyone who criticizes them, and that is something where we've actually just 2 weeks ago did a study also on focusing on German hate campaigns, German coordinated hate campaigns, often coordinated by identitarian and alt-right people in Germany, And we found that, in fact, so we did that with a German NGO called Ich bin hier, and we found that, in fact, a lot of the hate that we saw, or a lot of the likes of the hateful comments below news sections, in the news comment sections on Facebook, actually came from a very small amount of people who were specifically coordinating these campaigns. So we found that 5% of the accounts that were active in January were responsible for over 50% of the likes of hate speech comments. So sometimes then these coordinated campaigns were directed against individuals or against organizations. Sometimes they were against entire communities, demonizing Muslim or immigrant communities. And we found specifically in 3 of the major campaigns that we saw were happening were coordinated on Discord and on Telegram. There were also politicians from the Alternative for Germany who were picking up on the same hashtags that originated from these extreme right platforms, and thereby also managed to mainstream and to amplify or to extend the reach of these campaigns. In a similar way, some of the Russian bots that we spotted, sometimes to the surprise of the extreme right activists, but they also managed to amplify some of the hashtags and some of the campaigns on Twitter, especially. But sometimes that was really to the surprise of the extreme right activists, who would then say something like, "Oh, this is strange. I've had so many retweets by all of these Russian bots." They were actually confused themselves where this came from. And the third amplification factor is, of course, media, mainstream media that picks up on these campaigns, but especially in this case, in the Germany case, we found that Russian media, like Russia Today and Sputnik News, were often taken on board were reporting even about the hashtags used by the campaigns, and were really not offering any critical analysis, but simply amplifying in a way the reach of these campaigns and mainstreaming the ideologies that the extreme right intended to spread with those. Then doxing, trolling, and threats is something we've also experienced on a quite regular basis recently. I myself have been, after releasing our last report in October on the connectivity of the extreme right, have had several attempts of people, for example, leaking my address, telephone number, and so on. But that's, of course, a strategy that is becoming increasingly common also among the extreme right. We're here working with several NGOs across Europe to really to counter that and to help develop early warning systems, or even things like hate finders, for example, for coordinated hate campaigns, but also initiatives that would prevent doxing from happening, and would build awareness especially among journalists or activists who are frequently victims of such. But I think in the US, I've read that even a lot of academics, or we've also spoken about that earlier today, that even academics have become victims of these doxing and trolling campaigns. And then finally, there are also, of course, there are different strategies of how to intimidate opponents. Often it's about leaking information, or somehow getting information, releasing information about individuals who want to harm. ISIS has also been, or pro-ISIS groups have also been active in developing hacking capabilities. This is something where I've also been monitoring a few of the Telegram chats where they are speaking about hacking routers, starting with simple hacks. I think they are still working, of course, on trying to hack critical infrastructure, and they are still working on spreading information among their networks and how to carry out hacking attacks. But this is, of course, something where we're also keeping an eye on the groups that are actually in the process of getting better at this. And lastly, these groups that I've been monitoring were in the end actually hacked themselves. So I think there is probably also room for discussing ways of well, trolls trolling the trolls, or hackers hacking hackers. There are, of course, some responses to these intimidation strategies. The question is, what are the best responses? What are the most effective ones? Should we try to troll the trolls? Should we try to hack the hackers? Or are there other forms of solutions that we should offer for these problems and to these intimidation strategies? But I think the conclusions that we've really drawn from these various pieces of research is that right now extremists are a bit ahead of the curve, and I think a bit ahead of us on 3 different levels. One is their use of the new technological innovations, of new technologies in general, but also of these known bugs that we spoke about, especially of the echo chamber effects. And I think they will always stay early adopters of technology because they are in the asymmetric they are in the weaker position in this kind of asymmetric warfare, so they have to stay innovative. And I think it's really up to us to keep up with this really high pace that we've seen both on the extreme right, but also from Islamist extremists, and I'm sure also from other forms of extremism. And the second one is the exploitation of the international synergies and this cross-border, but also cross-ideological collaboration. I think we've increasingly tried to team up with think tanks in the US, but I think there's still a significant gap between the research and the policies and initiatives created in Europe and the one that's happening in the US, and I'd really be in favor of more transatlantic cooperation also in giving responses to these problems. And the third level is the weaponization of youth culture and how both sides have been able to create appealing countercultures and have used gamification and interesting concepts for young people to recruit them. And we haven't really matched that level of counterculture or providing an interesting alternative to that, I think. So on the basis of that, this might sound a bit negative, but I'm actually quite confident that we might be able to get better on all these levels, and I'd be interested in hearing your ideas for solutions, also what we at ISD should look at developing, what kind of initiatives you think would be needed. Thank you. Oh, and lastly, so this is the report that I spoke about the international connectivity of the extreme right, with 3 case studies, one on the Defend Europe campaign, one on the Charlottesville rally, and one on the German election influencer campaigns. And this is actually my book, which is more about the interplay between different forms of extremism, between far-right and Islamist extremism, because of their complementary views and strategies of polarizing societies, and of the idea of an ongoing or imminent war between Muslims and non-Muslims, and how this becomes mainstream also through the media and politicians who further feed into this simplistic worldview of two opposing worlds basically having to fight each other in a preemptive war. Any questions? Yeah.
In one of your slides, you seem to suggest that you have a list of Russian bots to track. Can I ask how and from where you construct that list of Russian bot accounts on Twitter?
Yeah. Well, in this case, this was really just from what we've been monitoring qualitatively in the ethnographic research we did in the messaging groups. But we've also, my colleagues have also released a bigger report, actually with Peter Pomerantsev and the LSE Arena Center. There was a joint research before the German election on the role of Russian bots, of Russian media in trying to amplify some of the campaigns led by extreme activists, extreme right but extreme left activists, to try to influence the election outcome.
And by bots, you mean they are purely algorithmic, or they're just trolls?
No, so you're right, in some of the cases, I think in the report they spoke of cyborgs. They call them cyborgs because they're a mixture of, they are real people, but often real people operating several accounts, and sometimes they would be box. But that's something you can look up in, the report is called Make Germany Great Again.
Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was wondering for the, this is just quite a general question, right? When you think about it, for both the, I mean, the alt-right and the this extremist, although I guess maybe it's the latter, it's a little more clear. What are the motivations? That is, there's not a financial motivation. Is it really fundamentally some kind of like pro-social type motivation in the sense that they are giving up their time and effort to this cause they believe in?
Yeah, well, I think in both the cases, because they want to provoke overreactions from the establishment in order to reshuffle the cards to bring about, they are both chaos agents because they want to bring about political change. But I think the groups that we've been following more closely are not adopting militant strategies, but really meta-political strategies and trying to to have an impact on society and on politics in the long term by using these different strategies of, on the one hand, shifting the Overton window or the window of what's acceptable in discourse to further to the right or towards Islamist ideologies, and on the other hand, intimidating people.
And I guess maybe just the thing that struck me here was the huge amount of work, of like time and effort that was going into this. This was like what, like, you know.
That's why I think the whole gaming, the role of gaming communities on the one hand, but also the gamification of it is so interesting because, of course, gamers and some of the alt-right people come from these communities are used to harvesting and kind of are very patient in the way that they would approach challenges. And in a similar way, the way that they make it very much fun to take part in these actions and that they create this group identity, I think that makes it more attractive to even and makes people probably more patient in staging some of these campaigns. Yeah.
So you showed some of the reactions within these communities to the research, which were generally negative. Is there, I mean, okay, that was a major understatement, but is there, like, within these communities elsewhere, sort of a serious or scholarly discussion of these techniques and how they're used and how to improve them, and any like actual reaction to the research and to the findings, or is it all still sort of organized by instinct, and anytime someone tries to study it, they just don't care about those sorts of explanations?
You mean whether the doxing and trolling things are coordinated or organic or?
Yeah, or in general, is the whole system you described of like recruiting somewhere and organizing somewhere else, are there people at any stage in the chain being like, we should figure out best practices and organize this and try to figure out what's going on in some sort of weirdly analogous scholarly sense to what you're doing?
Yeah, definitely. We saw that on the one hand, there are clear manuals, especially used by Generation Identity or created by Generation Identity for example, this media guerrilla warfare manual that outlines the different strategies and tactics that they want to use. And sometimes some of these strategies that are discussed also draw on materials from GCHQ, for example, or from strategic communication insights that I'm not sure how they receive, sometimes from leaked documents, sometimes from maybe their own experience in the military, where they use military strategies of stratcoms and info ops to explicitly carry out on the basis of best practices carry out their operations.
Thanks for your talk, and this is very much in line with what I do. So I guess my question, I know this is a hard one, is what is your, like, how do you measure impact? Or you talk about mainstreaming, and like what is your baseline in this context? Because I noticed you had like this Twitter debate on like 120 dB, and like a colleague and I have the data on this like discourse on Twitter, like all the tweets. And kind of like what we saw there is that this mainstreaming, at least on Twitter, which is like obviously not the best platform for Germany to begin with, but like didn't actually like follow through with it. It stayed within like this right-wing bubble. It kind of like shifted a little bit to the US, but it really didn't have like an influence on like the overall German like mainstream Twitter sphere, if you can call it that.
Yeah, that's true. So the thing with Facebook, of course, so usually we use Crimson Hexagon to analyze the impact on mostly Twitter because of the API constraints for Facebook. It's of course more difficult to measure the impact there. Well, they also changed the access to the API in January, I think. So it makes it a bit harder. Well, for the hate finder, for example, that we were developing with Ich bin hier, it's harder to now spot coordinated campaigns with that script that or with that algorithm. But otherwise, the way we measure the impact is really by looking at how many mainstream news platforms report about it, how many politicians pick up on it. But it's true that in terms of the reach, it's the 120 dB campaign was not one of the biggest campaigns. I think the biggest or was one of the biggest in the last couple of months. But really, the biggest in Germany was the pre-election campaign, and there they really managed to get into the top trends for weeks with the hashtags that they agreed on. And AFD was even the hashtag AFD was fluctuating between first and second rank in Germany on Twitter. But for Facebook, it's something we have to measure separately.
Time for about one or two more questions.
Okay.
Have you found any evidences of connections between the analysis you did in Italy and the one you did in Germany? Beyond the theory of extreme right supporting each other in the countries, I'm thinking about sites and things like this, referencing to each other.
Referencing. So what we found is that both reference to the American alt-right and both have also links, for example, would sometimes share links or resources from American extreme right and alt-right activists. And we've also seen the same vocabulary and similarities in tactics used, but then there are also slight differences. But in general, the question that we've been starting to also pose ourselves is to what extent all of this is organic and really just originates on the Chan boards, and to what extent there is some form of maybe external support or orchestration behind this because of these patterns that we see and the parallels that we see. Yeah.
Yeah, well, congratulations for the presentation and the research. And well, I mean, you mentioned at the end of the presentation about start thinking about new ways of do research, of combining programs. And I think that this is a clear example of how these kind of researchers should be focused. I mean, I think it's so important to understand these groups not in an isolated way, but to compare different extremist violent movements and to put them in comparison, because they are part of the same phenomenon.
Yeah.
So it doesn't make sense to understand religious extremism as a different phenomenon as far-right extremism, although prejudices or stereotypes might think that they are completely antagonist movements, but they are part of the same phenomenon. So I think the great value of their research is to put all of these phenomena in the same comparison in order to see how they are using the same tools and they are part of the same kind of nihilistic movement. This is one of the same, I think one of these kind of groups, they don't have any, and this is the question for you, do you found like there is a deep ideology behind all these groups, or they are much closer to a nihilistic Bakunian movement that for real politics and for Islamist movements, I mean, right, and considering the right as a political movement? Do you think that these movements are closer to kind of nihilistic thing than regular ideology?
Yeah, these two really interesting questions. I think on the second one about ideology, there are lots of differences between the different groups that we're monitoring. But what's interesting now is that increasingly they are trying to overcome some of the ideological differences between the groups and collaborate simply for for having a bigger effect. And also with, for example, there's a strong difference between, of course, some of the European movements, which are more careful, at least out as how they present themselves publicly. They would not speak about race or anti-Semitism. They would have more a language that is focused on culture, while the alt-right is more explicit in speaking about that. But also then some of the individuals that take part in the actions seem to arrive in even in the private messaging groups without really being, sometimes they're not even political, sometimes they might just have a set of grievances, and it's more the whole counterculture gamification aspect that brings them in than the ideology in some cases. In others, they're very ideological. Yeah.